All right, picture this. It's July 1943, the absolute height of the Battle of Kursk. You're inside a German Tiger tank. You feel untouchable. You're wrapped in 80 tons of the best steel Krupp can make, you've got a cannon that can knock out anything you see, and your optics are top-notch. You are, for all intents and purposes, the king of the battlefield. All around you, Soviet tanks are just burning.
But then, something happens that just shouldn't be possible. A Tiger gets taken out by a standard T-34, a tank whose gun, according to all the manuals, couldn't even scratch its frontal armor. Later, when the engineers are picking through the wreckage, they find this single, tiny, perfectly round hole. Now, the official report said it couldn't be done, but there it was. And that little hole? It was the start of a massive secret.
So let's really put ourselves in that moment. You're a veteran German commander. Through your periscope, you spot your next target, a classic T-34. From 800 meters away? That's an easy kill. Your gunner lines up the shot, totally confident. Why wouldn't he be? You've seen hundreds of Soviet shells just bounce right off your armor, leaving little more than a scratch.
And then the Soviet tank fires. The German crew barely even flinches. They're just waiting for that familiar, dull thud of a ricochet. But this time, it's different. Instead, there's this sharp, dry crack, almost like the lash of a whip. Something tiny, almost invisible, has just sliced through 100 millimeters of hardened steel like it was made of paper.
Inside the Tiger, it's all over in an instant. A flash of white-hot metal and vaporized tungsten just annihilates the crew. When the German engineers get a look at the wreck later, they are just completely stumped. The entry hole is perfectly circular, no bigger than a coin, with no jagged edges at all. It honestly looks like someone took a giant drill bit and just punched right through the armor. How on earth was that possible?
Well, to unravel this battlefield mystery, we actually have to rewind about a year, back to 1942. At this point, Soviet engineers were facing a huge crisis. You see, the early success of their famous T-34 tank was starting to wear off as these new, heavily armored German tanks began showing up and completely changing the rules of tank warfare.
Soviet tank crews were literally up against impossible physics. Look at this. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick, but the standard 76 millimeter gun on their T-34s, it could only punch through about 60 millimeters of armor, and that's at 500 meters. The math just didn't work. Their shells were basically just bouncing off.
And for the guys on the ground, in the tanks, this was a life-or-death problem. Ricochet was the word they hated more than any other. It meant you just gave away your position, your shot was completely useless, and now the enemy, sitting in his superior tank with his superior gun, was turning to fire back at you. Your only real option was this desperate, high-risk charge to get in close and try to hit their weaker side armor.
The Soviets needed an answer, and they needed it yesterday. But building a whole new tank or designing a more powerful gun, that would take way too long. So the solution wasn't a new gun at all. No, it was a radical new shell, an idea born from a really simple law of physics.
They called it a subcaliber shell, and the idea behind it was just brilliant. Think about it like this. Say you want to punch through a wall. Would you rather use a big, soft pillow or a thin steel crowbar, hitting it with the exact same amount of force? The crowbar, right? Of course. By concentrating all that energy onto one tiny point, you create immense, incredible pressure. This new shell did exactly that.
And the way it worked was so simple, it was elegant. First, because the whole shell was super light, the T-34's gun could fire it at an unbelievable velocity. Then when it smacked into the tank's armor, that lightweight outer casing just shattered on impact. But the small, super dense tungsten core inside, it kept going, just from sheer inertia, punching straight through the steel plate.
But actually creating this weapon, that was a whole other story, a real engineering thriller. The project was led by a designer named Nikolai Burmistrov, and he faced two massive hurdles. First, a critical shortage of the key ingredient, tungsten, and second, the absolute need to keep this whole thing a secret.
And that secrecy was everything. If the Germans found out that tungsten was the magic ingredient, you can bet they would have targeted the Soviet supply lines immediately. But even more important, the weapon's greatest power was surprise. The psychological shock of seeing a supposedly invincible Tiger suddenly get knocked out by a regular T-34, well, that was a weapon in itself.
Just how secret was it? Well, this weapon was incredibly rare. Because tungsten was basically more valuable than gold at the time, production was severely limited. Most tank crews were only given 2,
maybe 3 of these special shells. They were a weapon of last resort, a real ace up the sleeve for only the most desperate moments.
So, this secret weapon arrives at the front just in the nick of time for its trial by fire, the Battle of Kursk, July 1943. This is where that carefully guarded secret would finally be unleashed, and believe me, it would change the psychology of tank warfare forever.
It was a really desperate race against the clock. The first Tigers show up in late 1942, and they cause absolute shock among Soviet forces. By early 1943, the first of these sub-caliber shells were being secretly delivered to elite units, and this all led directly to their decisive use at Kursk, which, as we know, was one of the most critical turning points of the entire war.
You read the veteran accounts from that battle, and they just paint an incredible picture. Imagine you're a young lieutenant. Your T-34 is hidden in the ruins of a barn, and you're watching 3 Tigers advance right on your position. Your job? Stop them, at all costs. In your ammo rack, you have exactly 2 of the special shells. You know right then you have 0 room for error.
He waits. He lets the first Tiger get close, and then he fires. Direct hit. The Tiger just explodes. The other 2, they grind to a halt, completely confused. Their crews have no clue what just happened. The T-34 quickly repositions and uses its second and final special shell to take out the second Tiger. The third one, totally baffled and probably terrified, it just backs off and retreats. 2 shells, 2 dead Tigers.
So, you'd think a weapon this effective, this decisive, would become the stuff of legend, right? But after the war, the story of the sub-caliber shell just vanished. It got buried in classified archives, and for almost 50 years, pretty much nobody knew it even existed.
So why was it forgotten? Well, a few reasons. The secrecy was kept up during the Cold War. The official Soviet history preferred to focus on the power of mass-produced tanks, not some special crutch. And pretty soon, new tanks like the T-34-85 came along with a much more powerful gun, which made the shell less critical. The story just sort of faded away into the classified files.
And the sheer scale of production really tells the story of its role. In 1943, while the Soviets churned out over 10 million regular shells for the T-34's gun, they only made about 100,000 of these secret sub-caliber shells. It was never meant to be a standard weapon. It was a rare, precious scalpel, used surgically to solve a very specific and very deadly problem.
You know, the story of the BR-350P is just such a powerful reminder that history is often shaped not by the biggest army or the thickest armor, but by clever ideas. It's really a testament to the engineers who, under unbelievable pressure, found this elegant, brilliant solution. And it leaves us with a really fascinating question. What other secret stories like this are out there, just waiting in the archives, ready to show us that the greatest victories are won not by brute force, but by intellect and ingenuity?